Feeling stuck or just having trouble getting started with your watercolor today? I understand. Here's what helps me. Let me show you. I find the best thing to do is to start with something small and very simple, the sort of tiny painting that you can do in about 10 to 15 minutes. So what I'm sketching out here is a little bunch of lavender. I'm going to keep it as simple as possible, not thinking about putting in a background or anything like that, unless I feel like it when I get to that point of the painting, of course. Getting started can often be the hardest part of a lot of things, and watercolor is no exception. There's a sort of inertia you have to overcome. You don't need a masterpiece to get your mojo back, you just need to get that brush moving, to remember the fun of sliding the brush across the page and watching the colors dancing. And usually, a little painting like this is all it takes to get me right in the mood to paint something else, and feeling a lot more confident about it. I find I get more painting ideas when I'm actually painting. That's why the trick is just to make sure that you start. And the best way to do that is with a small, easy painting just like this one. It's a sort of painting that doesn't need a grand plan. No preliminary sketching, no colour swatching or value studies. It's just a bit of fun. It's the perfect way to get going. All of those things I just mentioned, the sketching and the swatching and the value studies, those are all helpful things, of course. But if you're finding it hard to get started, I bet those are the things that are getting in your way and making painting seem harder than it needs to be. So a little painting like this helps you get out of your head and back to the fun of it. That's what it's all about, really, isn't it? The thing about these small paintings is that there's no great expectation of them. There's no pressure. It's just about enjoyment. So they're usually a confidence booster. When you're struggling to get started, I think it very often comes down to confidence. You know, there's that quote I'm sure you've heard before. If you hear a voice within you say you cannot paint, then by all means paint, and that voice will be silenced. It really is true. If you find yourself procrastinating instead of painting, it's very often because of the unhelpful chatter in our own heads. That voice is often rather plausible, sometimes unkind, but seldom useful. Getting on with a quick, easy painting like this is the best thing I've ever found for pretty much instant relief. You see, a simple painting like this comes together rather quickly. It's only been a few minutes and I've already managed to put in all of the stems, including a little bit of variety to make sure I'm including some of the shadows in between those stems. And I've even started building up the colour for the lavender blooms at the end of those stems. And I'm painting with one of my favourite colours. This purple is called manganese violet, and I really enjoy painting with this colour. It granulates rather beautifully, and I love watching the way it spills out and creates texture into the slightly damp parts of the paper. That's actually another helpful tip, I think, when you're trying to get started. Is to make sure that you are choosing to paint with some of the colours that you know and love. You know, just painting with your happy colours is often enough to transport you back to that happy place where painting is the only thing you want to do and you stop worrying about all sorts of other things. And speaking of lovely colours, I've got a colour that I'm not sure whether I love it or hate it there. That colour is actually called lavender. So I'm not sure I could paint lavender without using this colour. Seems wrong, doesn't it? But one of the things that I'm not sure about with lavender is that it's not completely transparent. It's that lovely, soft, gentle purple blue. But the reason it is that colour is because it's got some titanium white in it, and that is what makes it a little bit opaque. I don't love that. It's just a personal preference. I do prefer the more transparent colours, but all the same, I love the way it plays with these other purples on the page. And that's one of the reasons I've chosen to do a simple painting of lavender, is that I know it's quite easy to suggest the flowers. You know, they are a very simple structure if you take it in this sort of impressionist style. And it's great fun to be building up these little tiny marks of colour that are suggesting the way the tiny blooms collect at the top of each stem. And to be able to drop in lots of different colours is also very enjoyable, and it's a way to make sure that your painting is definitely interesting. You see, a tiny little painting like this is enough to remind you of all these things that will make a painting interesting to look at, which is simple things like a variety of colours, a variety of marks, and a variety in values. And you can do all of these things in a small, simple, measured way in a teeny tiny painting. And remember that you know all these things, and remember what fun it is to see the painting emerge underneath your brush. And that is often all it takes to give you confidence to go on to tackle another slightly more ambitious painting. But of course, there's no need to. You know, sometimes just doing one tiny little 10 to 15 minute painting a day is more than enough. You know, it's enough to lift your mood, remind you that you're a creative person, give you that little bit of escape from the rest of the world. It might be all you need. So this sort of tiny painting is valuable in so many ways, not just as a starter painting, but sometimes as enough of a little creative escape for the day. I love all of those light pinks and purples that I've managed to include in the sort of flower section at the end of those stems. But I think it's when you start popping in the dark sections that it really comes to life. It's the contrast between the light sections and the dark sections that give your subject dimension and volume and depth. So I think this is always one of the most fun parts of the painting. And I decided that since I had enjoyed putting in the dark sections in the purple part, that I probably needed to think a little bit more about a few darker sections in the green stems. And the other thing that I like to do is to make sure that there's sort of harmony in those colour sections. Even in the greens, I want to use some of the dark purples to put in the shadows. It's a nice way to create a harmony in your painting where all the parts of it are kind of talking to each other. And the purples would very often be reflected in the stems. You know, if you see a reference photo, or even better, if you happen to be lucky enough to be looking at a bunch of lavender in real life, I'm sure you'll find that you'll see some of those purples even in the green sections and vice versa. So that's something I definitely want to capture. Now, I decided that I was going to keep this very simple and not have a background, but I do think that anything I paint, I prefer to give it a place in time and space, which usually means all it needs is a little shadow. And I have to say, shadows are one of my favourite things to paint. I don't know why. I think in watercolour it's actually a lovely thing to paint probably because of the transparency of the watercolour. But I want to try and keep it subtle. So I think to start with, I'm going to just go with the lavender colour, which is my palest blue. So I've got a lovely soft blue to sit as the shadow, but I don't want it to be a hard line. So I'm just softening the edge of that blue mark that I put down. And I rather like that because that does instantly settle the bunch of lavender down onto a surface. I like it, but should we go a little bit bolder? Sometimes it's just because it's so much fun, you kind of want to do it again. So I think I will. I think I will expand that out a little bit further. I want to try and still keep it a little bit lighter, so I won't go too heavy with the paint. You know, this is the thing with watercolour though, if I do go too heavy, I can always blot it up, I can soften it off, I can use a thirsty brush. There's so many things you can do, and you need a tiny little low stakes painting like this to just remind yourself of all of that. Now, if you're saying, well, it's all very well to tell me to just paint, but what should I paint? I've got you covered. Obviously, start with a little painting just like this, but I do think it's helpful to have a short list, a very short list of some simple subjects in mind. If you want help picking subjects, I do have a separate video about that, and I'll put a link to that in the cards. But remember, It's just a simple painting. It doesn't need to be something fancy, and it can be the very same simple painting that you painted yesterday. There really is no shame in painting the same subjects over and over again. In fact, I think that's rather a brilliant way to go about things, and I talked about that more in the video I've popped up on the screen now. You can watch that one next. Happy painting!